Let me ask you something. Is there anything that you would die for? I've been promising for a while that I would talk about the Crusades. And really, I'm just going to talk about the First Crusade, which takes place in the 1090s AD. And the reason that I'm talking about it now is because, like I said last week, when you read the Song of Roland, you have to know a little bit about the history that it describes, that is the 8th century AD, and the reign of Charlemagne, and the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. I talked about all of that last week. But this week, I'm going to talk about the other thing you have to know about, and that is the history of the period when the poem is being composed. So like I said, the poem's probably composed over the course of the turn of the 12th century. So the 1090s are when this First Crusade occurs. And so you can see in the Song of Roland that the ideology, some of the ideas and the rhetoric that had been going into shaping the First Crusade also go into shaping the Song of Roland. Here is what I am not trying to say to you today. I am not trying to say to you that everything that every Christian ruler has ever done has been good and perfect and fine. And I'm not trying to give you a revisionist history of the Crusade. What I am trying to do, though, is I'm trying to get deeper than just this sort of knee-jerk thing that we have now from our comfortable position of Western liberalism, where we say, oh, wasn't it awful that those nasty Christians went and murdered all of those brown people in cold blood, right? Like, we have this idea. President Obama, back when he was president, said something like, we Westerners can't get up on our high horse because we had the Crusades, and that was this terrible sin in our past. And I spent a little bit of time last week just suggesting, right, that it's completely absurd for us, from our position of stability, to condemn the people who created Europe for operating in the world that they lived in, which was a world of existential conflict. And there were good and bad people involved in all of those conflicts, and every person involved was terribly flawed because we live in a broken world. The Song of Roland dramatizes the conflict between the Muslim world and the Christian world into a struggle of good and evil, battle of good and bad. And the reason for that, I said, is because this author believes that Christianity is true and that Christendom is good and that Christian nations have a right to exist. Or in this case, nation is kind of a misleading, anachronistic term, but Christian peoples have a right to exist and occupy their ancestral lands. And I asked, right, do we still believe that? Do we believe that we are good and that we get to live, right? We may not believe that we should go forth and conquer, but do we at least believe, right, that we get to have the West and do the West and be America and, be the countries of Europe? Many of the nations of Europe look to me as if they don't believe that anymore. And so on that level, I actually think there's something a lot more admirable in the Roland attitude, which is like, yeah, we live here, we have a way of life, we think it's a good way of life, and we're willing to die for it. And that's why I asked that question, right? Because until we are willing to die for something that's bigger than ourselves, we don't get to sit in judgment over the Christians or the Muslims, right? This is the funny thing, right? Because in this poem and in the history of the Crusades, it's actually not just the Christians who come across as sort of admirable. The Roland poet obviously thinks that Muslims are wrong, but he does not think that they're just wholly evil and base. And today we're going to talk about a character, the Emir of Babylon, who's actually a very noble Muslim. Both of these sides of this conflict, right, are noble inherently because they have an attitude about theology and the world and God, which they place above their own lives, right? And they're willing to die for that. Whatever else is true about the Crusades, however many missteps, however much demonization was involved, that is a true historical reality about it. And it's kind of the core reality. Until you understand that, you don't understand the period, right? Until you understand that God was real for all of these people and that had real material consequences for them, you can't sit in judgment of the Muslims or the Christians in the Crusades. So that's thing number one, right? And then thing number two, the immediate question becomes, well, they're shuttering churches already. The state is obviously manifestly hostile to Christianity. I hope it won't get this way, but it's not impossible that we'll get to a place again where Christianity is persecuted by the state, like it was when it first began. You know, under the Roman Empire, before the Roman Empire was Christian, Christians suffered incredible, terrible persecution and were willing to die for the faith. Are we willing? Do we value our beliefs more than our own lives? Unless we feel that way, then we can't sit in judgment of Pope Urban II or any of the other guys that I'm going to talk about today. But just let's back up for a second and let's talk about a little bit of history. So I talked last week about the state of Europe and the state of Christendom. I talked about the allegiance that had grown up between the Frankish Empire and the Roman, the Bishop of Rome, who was the Pope, and this is, you know, this state of affairs has sort of persisted, even though there's a power vacuum after Charlemagne dies, and a lot of things happen that kind of fracture the Carolingian Empire and bring it to its end. But effectively, right, that European battleground and that European arrangement that came into being under Charlemagne persists. And the Byzantine Empire, which is the eastern part of the eastern kind of remnant of the Roman Empire, has really started to crumble and crater. And in some ways, it crumbled under the stronger advancing force of Islam. So brief potted history, right, of the development of Islam. You have Muhammad, the initial prophet, and then you immediately have tension and disagreement over who should succeed him as the leader of all of these tribes that he had gathered under himself. Eventually, this is going to become the source of a conflict that still exists today, and that is a conflict between the Shia and the Sunni, or the Shiite and the Sunni sort of dimensions of Islam or factions of Islam. And that conflict is over whether the person who succeeds Muhammad needs to be personally related to him, or whether the loyalty is more to the kind of institution. Because right after Muhammad dies, there's a sort of election, a contested election, which puts Abu Bakr as the caliph. Caliph just means like the successor, basically. And that's where you get the word caliphate, which becomes this big thing. And so by the time of the Crusades, Islam had already gone through 3 caliphates. There were the rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidun, and the Rashidun were these 4 caliphs that followed Muhammad before the official split of Sunni and Shia. There was always this sense that Ali, who was Muhammad's son-in-law, should succeed, and that Abu Bakr was the wrong person because he wasn't related. He was, you know, the sort of Shiite impulse was, well, our loyalty was to this guy, Muhammad, and not to this institution, and not to this kind of power-hungry political empire, essentially. If you really want to engage face-to-face with the great works of antiquity, you got to learn Latin and Greek. And the people to do it with are the Ancient Language Institute. They are experts at teaching people of every experience level how to read Latin and Ancient Greek. And in their fall semester, which they're signing people up for now, they are also going to be teaching Biblical Hebrew, which is incredible. I'm super excited about this. Hebrew, obviously, language of the Old Testament, of the Bible, and it's just wonderful to be able to read that in the original language. What you do is you go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics to get started. And when you use the code heretics, HERETICS, you get 15% off. These classes fill up really, really fast. They filled up very quickly last time. I'm sure they are currently filling up. So get your spot now. You can engage with them to figure out the right class for you. And there definitely is one. They especially give special Latin courses for middle school students and high school students, which is awesome. It'll help you with all sorts of things, including your English, right? Because a lot of words come from Latin. So go to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics, use the offer code heretics, and get 15% off. Now, so there was this tension brewing, and finally, to make a long story, very long story, kind of short, right? That split becomes official when Ali does become the 4th rightly guided caliph, but there erupts a civil war, which results in the creation of the Umayyad Caliphate. And the Umayyads are a Sunni caliphate, and the Shia basically peace out, and they take control over what will eventually become the Fatimid dynasty. And so you already have this split within Islam, but during that same time, under Abu Bakr, but especially under Omar, who was the second rightly guided caliph, the Muslim empire, or the kind of gradually developing caliphate, is spreading out into Syria, which was a major stronghold of Byzantium, and taking over the Persian Empire, which, remember, had been around since forever. They had been beaten by the Greeks, but they didn't go away. They remained an incredibly important area, but now they are taken over by the Muslims. And so the Umayyad Caliphate kind of comes into the inheritance of this rapidly growing empire, which is already pushing into Christendom, right? This is the other thing you have to remember, is that the Byzantine Empire was different from the Frankish Empire, but they were allied by this growing sense of Christendom, of Christianity, of certain domains being Christian, and those domains having an allegiance together to one another, even if they also were warring amongst themselves. So it is not as if this was just like, oh, Muslims exist, we must go kill them. It was like this was a developing, growing power that was threatening the edges and the borders, and in some cases the heartland of Christian territory. So under the Umayyads, this thing really kind of, the Muslim empire really expands and expands. And we talked last week about how that expansion was finally turned back at the Battle of Poitiers, or it's the Battle of Tours, it's sometimes called, by Charles Martel. Charles Martel is not the king, but he eventually establishes what will become the Carolingian line, which is where Charlemagne comes from. Fast forward post-Charlemagne, and the Umayyads have given way to the Abbasids. But the people in charge of Jerusalem, which is the really important bit, right, the Holy Land, those people are called the Seljuk Turks. It's not a convert the whole world to Islam thing. It's more a, take political power sort of thing. So Christianity has this sense that we're not only going to take over this realm, but more and more as we ally with the Pope and with the Church, right, we're going to be a Christian community, a community of Christians. Muslims are kind of more happy for there to be a lot of Jews and Christians running around, but they do, the caliphates are expansionist projects, and they are in conflict with these sort of neighbors, right? These Christian neighbors, especially Byzantium. And so the First Crusade is really sort of kicked off when the East asks the West for help. That is, the East of Christendom asks the West of Christendom for help. And this developing idea that Christendom is a unified thing becomes this project conceived by Pope Urban II to take back Jerusalem, to take back the Holy Land. And so I'm going to read to you now just a portion of a book called The Crusade by Thomas Asbridge, which I think is really great, pretty fair about this stuff. And here's a portion in which he describes Urban's project of going forth to Jerusalem. Asbridge writes, Urban II was perhaps 60 years old when he launched the First Crusade in 1095. The son of northern French nobility and a former cleric and Cluniac monk, he became pope in 1088 at a time when the papacy, reeling from a rancorous and protracted power struggle with the Emperor of Germany, stood on the brink of overthrow. So parlous was Urban's position that it took him 6 years to reassert control over Rome's Lateran Palace, the traditional seat of papal authority. Yet, through cautious diplomacy and the adoption of measured rather than confrontational policies of reform, the new pope oversaw a gradual renaissance in the prestige and influence of his office. By 1095, this slow rejuvenation had begun, but the papacy's notional right to act as head of the Latin Church and spiritual overlord to every Christian in Western Europe was still far from realized. I talked about this a little bit last week, that the papacy, right, was not the thing that it currently is, which is the undisputed official head of all Catholics, right? It was a very important role in the Latin-speaking church, because remember, the Western Christians speak primarily Latin, the Eastern Christians in Byzantium speak primarily Greek, and the Pope is now ascending gradually over the Latin-speaking church. In March 1095, Urban was presiding over an ecclesiastical council in the northern Italian city of Piacenza when ambassadors from Byzantium arrived. They bore an appeal from the Greek Christian emperor Alexius I Comnenus, a ruler whose astute and assertive governance had arrested decades of internal decline within the Great Eastern Empire. Exorbitant programs of taxation had refilled the imperial treasury in Constantinople, restoring Byzantium's aura of authority and munificence. So remember I said that they were kind of in decline when the rightly guided caliphs were expanding outward. And now this guy Alexius has basically taken back a little bit of control. But, writes Asperge, Alexius still faced an array of foreign enemies, including the Muslim Turks of Asia Minor. He thus dispatched a petition for military aid to the council in Piacenza, urging Urban to send a detachment of Latin troops to help repel the threat posed by Islam. Alexius probably hoped for little more than a token force of Frankish mercenaries, a small army that could be readily shaped and directed. In fact, over the next 2 years, his empire would be practically overrun by a tide of humankind. And he's referring here to this massive endeavor that Urban II musters. Now, in a second, we're going to get into the ways in which Urban's decision to make this into a grand holy war campaign was self-interested, right, and involved a certain degree of his own desire to take control over and have power over the Latin church, to consolidate that power. So I was talking to Chad Cat the other day, and he really wanted me to tell you about Public Goods because he loves their cat food. No, I actually really love everything from Public Goods. They're this incredible company, publicgoods.com, where you can get all sorts of stuff in this really clean, beautiful packaging, and you know that there's no weird, like, gross additives like you get at the grocery store. I'm a big health nut myself. I fiend on their chocolate-covered almonds. I eat that stuff all the time. But at this point, like, my house is full of like soap and really a lot of great products. And when I talk about those freeze-dried duck nibs, they sound hilarious, but they're actually great. They're this wonderful cat food that my cat loves. So everything there is kind of awesome. And they will give you this incredible deal for being a Young Heretics listener. It's literally just free stuff. That's the deal. If you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use code heretics at checkout, you will get $15 off your first Public Goods order with no minimum purchase. So you could buy like $10 worth of stuff, right? And that would be free. Get free stuff, publicgoods.com/heretics. Use code heretics at checkout. Get your freeze-dried duck nibs. Get your chocolate-covered almonds. Get tea, really any other stuff that they have. It's all incredible. publicgoods.com/heretics. Okay. So in part, right, this is like, obviously we need to be talking about this to do the Song of Roland. Obviously it's an important thing to discuss in general, but this is just such an amazing and fascinating period of history with these shifting dynamics that have been going on, right, since the domain of Charlemagne, right, this sort of gradual struggle for power over Europe, for power over Christendom, and for the power to lead the Latin Church, right? So Urban II basically unites this serious request for aid from Alexius, because remember again that he's dealing with an expansionist Muslim empire, the Sunni Caliphate. Urban basically allies that with this development that's been going on that we talked about already, which is the need to incorporate the knightly class, the fighting class, into acceptable Christian society and to civilize them, right? And to make them not just sort of roving hordes of pillaging crazy people, right? And so the state is involved in that, in the person of Charlemagne, but also in the person of Edward III, right, in England. But the church is also very involved in it. And so this development is like a theological development of how can we justify violence and how can we sanctify violence in such a way that it does not destroy the souls of the people who are involved in it. In some ways, this goes all the way back to like St. Augustine and his idea about the just war, right, that has to be undertaken for a good reason, under a legitimate authority, all of this stuff. But it's gradually becoming shaped and formed. Urban's predecessor, Gregory, had done something to sort of move in that direction. But Urban is the one who really finally sort of uses this request from Alexius as a way of formalizing the sanctification of a church-state conglomerate that can now be, again, right, not just powerful but stable, right, and have rules and civilization and a certain degree of spiritual, if not perfection, then certainly spiritual coherence, right? So this is what Urban does, and here's Asperge again. The Greek emperor's request appears to have chimed with notions already fermenting in Urban II's mind, and through the spring and summer that followed, the Pope refined and developed these ideas, envisaging an endeavor that might fulfill a broader array of ambitions, a form of armed pilgrimage to the east, what is now called a crusade. This comes from those who are signed with the crux, the cross, right? Crusade is basically just a word meaning endeavor for the cross. Historians have sometimes characterized Urban as the unwitting instigator of this momentous venture, suggesting that he expected only a few hundred knights to answer his call to arms. But in reality, he seems to have had a fairly shrewd sense of the potential scale and scope of his enterprise, and to have laid the foundations of widespread recruitment with some assiduity. Urban recognized that developing the idea of an expedition to aid Byzantium offered a chance not only to defend Eastern Christendom and improve relations with the Greek Church, but also to reaffirm and expand Rome's authority and to harness and redirect the destructive bellicosity of Christians living in the Latin West. I like that last sentence, right? To harness and redirect the destructive bellicosity of Christians living in the Latin West. There's a lot of infighting, as we talked about last week. There's a lot of turning inward. One of the things that Urban is doing here is he's finding a way to take all of that martial energy, all of that manly spirit that Roland kind of embodies, right, and turn it to good use for the stability of Christendom and the Christian realm. There is self-interest in that for Urban. There is cynicism. There is also good and civilization, and those things are bound up together, and we live in the world that was built by that civilization building. The European world, the world of the Renaissance, right? The world of, the great innovations of the West after the medieval period was made possible in part by the gradual, broken, sinful, messy formation of the Christian world under people like Urban, under people like Charlemagne. You could say all of those same things about the crazy, messy developments that I just described going on in the Muslim world, right? Obviously, I'm not a Muslim, so I don't believe that that was in service of the perfect divine truth that I believe the gospel is. But these are two civilizations that are developing, squabbling over some way that they're going to rule a territory and have a coherent society and civilization. Now, I believe that God guided and shaped the formation of Christendom. And I believe that he did so working with the flawed, broken, power-hungry people that he had to work with, as he continues to do, right? And our souls haven't gotten any better or nicer just because we happen to live in the stable world that was built for us in part by this period. So again, when we sit in judgment over this, we essentially cut off our nose to spite our own face, right? The idea that this is something like uniquely horrible and evil rather than just a development that occurred in the context of, warlords turning inward and turning outward to try and gain control and some stability over their territory, right? It's ludicrous to condemn the Crusades as Obama did, or as people typically do, right? This was a fight that was, that occurred because Alexius needed help and Urban needed control. This all seems to have come to a head at the Council of Clermont in 1095, when Urban preached the sermon which would launch this holy war and would gather all of these different tribes into battle against to take back Jerusalem, right, against the Turks and the Muslims that held Jerusalem. It's typically kind of difficult to get a full read on what that sermon was like because we have so many different sources, some of them conflict with each other. But it does seem as if this was a speech in which Urban either invented or just thought that there really was unbridled atrocity going on to the east, that Muslims were slaughtering Christians en masse, right? He basically did the same thing the poet does in Roland, where he dramatized and heightened what was actually going on, which was that there was, don't get me wrong, there was violence going on, and there was a threat from the Muslim world to the Byzantine Empire, but Urban really played it up. And this was, part of his effort to mobilize the troops. And so one reason why I have raised all of this at all is because we can clearly see the influence, the development of these kinds of ideas, the sanctification of knightly honor, right? And the heightened tension, conflict between these two civilizations. We can see that in the Song of Roland. And we talked a little bit about it, how, this is like a obvious sort of dramatization of a thing that actually happened in between Christians, right? Really, this was Christians betraying Christians at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. But because it's written around the time of the Crusades, it basically becomes a preface to the Crusades. It becomes this sort of you would say a crusade avant la lettre, what's going on with Charlemagne and the Muslims of Saragossa. That is to say, it's like a kind of prefiguration of the crusade that was actually going on. What I want to talk about now, as I read the second half, or really the last bit of the Song of Roland that I didn't get to last week, I want to talk about the fact that although that is true, and although the sort of spirit of Urban II kind of lives in this poem, the Song of Roland, it is not a poem that just demonizes Muslims. It casts them in a drama, right? And as I said, it believes in that drama that the Christians are the good guys. But it also, just like, in the spirit of Homer, who has this sort of sense that the Trojans were noble even though they were defeated by the Achaeans, and even though Homer is a Greek, right? There are a number of characters in this poem who are on the Muslim side, but who are quite noble, principally the emir of Babylon. So after Charlemagne finds out about the death of Roland and Oliver, he basically comes striding to avenge this terrible event because he's overcome with grief. Marsile, who is not particularly noble or exciting, Marsile, remember the king in Saragossa, Marsile sort of faints away and needs help from this outside power. And so the emir comes in, and the last bit of the poem is really this extended clash between the emir of Babylon and Charlemagne. So let me read a little bit about from the poem about that clash. The Emperor Charles, by force of arms and skill, full 7 years long in Spain has sojourned still, made many a city and many a castle his. Marsile has done his utmost to resist. In the first year letters went out from him to Baligant in Babylon, that is, to the emir, an ancient old man this. Homer and Virgil alike he has outlived. So remember, this is the 8th century, which means outliving Homer and Virgil would put this man at, like 1,000 years old plus. To Saragossa let him bring succor swift. If not, Marsile his Paynim gods will quit. Leave all the idols he worships, saith the writ. To the blessed faith of Christendom submit, and make his peace with Charlemagne the king. There's been delay, far off the emir lives. From 40 realms he's called his people in. His mighty dromons he has at length equipped. Carracks and barges, galleys and fighting ships. In Alexandria, where the wide harbor dips down to the sea, his whole fleet ready sits. In May, the day when summer first begins, with all his armies he looses from the ships. Huge are the forces of this detested race. The Paynim's voyage, searing with oars and sail, on the tall prows and on the masts they raise unnumbered lanterns and carbuncles ablaze. High overhead they throw out such a flame, the sea by night is beautiful and gay. And when they draw unto the land of Spain, the whole coast shines and glitters in the rays. Marsile hears news that they are on the way. So you can see already that there's this suggestion of a difference, a big difference between Marsile and the emir. Marsile, kind of this skeevy, cowardly guy, right? He's going to have to submit to Charlemagne just because he's afraid for his life. And the poem, I think, far more than condemning Muslims, the poem condemns people who aren't willing to die for their faith. And Marsile is not willing to die for his faith, right? And so that's why we sort of dislike him. The emir, by contrast, right, has outlived Homer and Virgil. He is this, hoary eminence, and he's coming, making the sea gay with his forces. There is this sense here that this is kind of borrowed, this idea is sort of borrowed from the First Crusade. I think that really the poet is thinking in terms of the conflict that eventually would arise between all of Christendom and all of the Muslim world. And so this kind of marshaling, right, of the greater forces of the Muslim world against the great King Charlemagne, who has now been himself called in as reinforcement after the kind of rear guard has been destroyed, is this sense of like, two worlds coming together to collide. And unlike the conflict between the skeevy Marsil and the valiant Roland, this really is two great rulers and leaders up against one another, the Emir and Charlemagne. So let me read now a passage about this kind of, these two armies meeting on the plain. A prudent man is the Emir, and wise. He calls his son and the two kings aside. Barons, my lords, set forward now and ride. All of my columns I'd have you lead and guide, save 3 reserves I'd keep of warriors tried. Firstly the Turks, next the Ormalian knights, and for the 3rd the giants of Malprise, and I myself will lead the Okian tribes, with Charlemagne and with his French to fight. If Carlon seeks to match his strength with mine, he'll have his head shorn from his trunk outright. That's all he'll get from me, and so he'll find. Huge are the hosts, their columns show right brave. Betwixt the two is neither hill nor vale, forest nor wood, cover is none to take. In open country they stand face to face. Quoth Baligant, my Paynims, up, away, ride forward now the battle to engage. Ambur of Oliferne the flag has raised, and on Précieuse the Paynims call by name. The French all shout, great loss you'll have this day, and loudly cry, Montjoie, Montjoie again. The Emperor Charles bids all his trumpets bray, and Oliphant sounds louder still than they. The Paynims cry, Charles has a fine array, battle we'll have, it will be grim and great. So you can see that the tone of the poem now shifts, right? And we've shifted from this kind of, in some ways, intimate personal drama, right, of Oliver and Roland fighting with each other, but then finally, dying valiantly in one another's arms, blessed by the archbishop, who also himself dies a gruesome death. That's this really sort of small drama that turns into this great act of heroism. Now we have the true big guns, right, get called in, and they clash in a kind of Lord of the Rings style, right, like two giant armies up against one another, with a certain degree of respect for each other, even though, of course, one is in the right and one is in the wrong, right? That it is not this idea that like that makes them all of the Emir's forces are terrible, evil people. No, they're prudent, wise, brave, right? All of these things. They're just in a conflict, as indeed Europe was in a conflict with the Muslim world during the time that this poem was being composed. Let me note briefly about this cry Montjoie, because I actually think it's very telling. Obviously, by the way, Charlemagne is going to emerge victorious from this confrontation, and the very last bit of the poem is sort of the fallout from that, and the trial and the destruction of Ganelon, who was the traitor that set all of this off in the first place. You'll remember from last week. But I want to talk briefly about this Montjoie, because it's another indication that the poet is thinking about contemporary events or contemporary issues, as well as thinking about this history of the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. You know who sucks? Big tech. You know who's awesome? ExpressVPN. It used to be that like private citizens did not have to worry about their personal information being shared by third parties. Now, everything that you do online, there are hundreds of data brokers whose one job is to buy and sell your data. I really find this gross and creepy, especially because I do not like the people that run the major websites that I use a lot of the time. One of the things that they are selling to one another is my IP address. Data harvesters use your IP address to uniquely identify you and your location. That is why I use ExpressVPN. When I use it, my connection gets rerouted through an encrypted server, and my IP address is masked. Super, super easy to use. All you have to do on any device, phone, laptop, smart TV, whatever, tap one button, you are protected. So if you think this is important, and it is, and if like me, you do not want to have your every move tracked by crazy people who want to sell your data, visit expressvpn.com/heretics and get 3 extra months for free. So expressvpn.com/heretics, expressvpn.com/heretics to learn more. Okay. Montjoie, what is this about? This is the battle cry, right, of the Frankish people, of the French. And the poet takes a moment to explain why they cry Montjoie. It tells you everything, almost everything that you need to know about this poet's religious outlook and the religious outlook that he was working with in his time. So I'm reading now actually from a translation that's available free online, just in case you don't want to spring for the Dorothy Sayers edition, although you should. just to give you a sense of another, this is a kind of more continuous prose translation. In the mead, the emperor made his bed, with his mighty spear beside his head, nor will he doff his arms tonight, but lies in his broidered hauberk white. Laced is his helm, with gold inlaid, girt on Joyeuse, the peerless blade, which charges 30 times a day, the brightness of its varying ray. Nor may the lance unspoken be, which pierced our Saviour on the tree. Carl, that's another name for Charlemagne, Carl hath its point, so God him graced within, his golden hilt enchased. And for this honour and boon of heaven, the name Joyeuse to the sword was given. The Franks may hold it in memory. Thence came Montjoie, their battle cry, and thence no race with them may vie. Now, joyeuse in French means joyous, and so this is a joyous lance, even though it pierced the side of Christ, because at this time, relics from that era of Christ's life were considered incredibly important and incredibly powerful. And so this cry of Montjoie makes reference to the fact that Charlemagne has this spear, which enables him to prosper in battle because it is from the soldier who pierced Christ's side on the cross. It's this incredible melding, right, of the gritty, terrible conflict that human beings in a broken world are up against, with presided over, right, by divine joy, which goes deeper than just like being happy or everything being okay, and makes reference to the Christ story, in which suffering is ultimately kind of redeemed and sanctified by Christ's conquering death. And so it's this, sort of theological gloss, this amazing theological gloss on the violence and the pain and the difficulty of the poem and the grief and the tragedy of Roland's death. It is also a real thing, this spear. Now, I am a complete agnostic about whether such things actually do come from the era that they're supposed to come from. But the spear that pierced Christ's side played a major role in the Crusades. As the Christian forces advanced eastward, they besieged a city called Antioch. And there were two sieges of Antioch, because when they besieged it from the outside and won, and then they were besieged in the city. And this was a terribly difficult time for them. They were basically being starved out. And there is a moment in which Peter Bartholomew, who is a peasant visionary, Asbridge calls him, digs up what he claims has been shown to him in a vision as the spear that pierced Christ's side. And so there's a description of this, a remarkable description of this, by somebody who was in the search for this. It's called the Holy Lance. This is by Raymond of Aguilé. We had been digging, he says, until evening, when some gave up hope of unearthing the lance. But the youthful Peter Bartholomew, seeing the exhaustion of our workers, stripped his outer garments and, clad only in a shirt and barefooted, dropped into the hole. He then begged us to pray to God to return his lance to the Crusaders so as to bring strength and victory to his people. Finally, in his mercy, the Lord showed us his lance, and I, Raymond, the author of this book, kissed the point of the lance as it barely protruded from the ground. What great joy and exultation then filled the city. This is something that happens probably after the poem, The Song of Roland, has initially been composed. But it's a remarkable parallel, and possibly it was added into the poem after, because the poem continues to be kind of edited and changed up to, after the First Crusade. So it's possible that this is this refers back to this moment. And so you have the layering on of history, right? That you have this actual historical event that is mythologized into this grand conflict, and the grand conflict that is kind of reflective of the mythology of the Crusades. It's really an incredibly artful thing in addition to everything else. So let's read, just to bring it to its conclusion, let's read a little bit of the last few passages. Charlemagne, in the fallout of all this, must explain to various people, including the Oliver's sister, who was betrothed to Roland, that Roland has died. Charlemagne himself has already grieved this in a very sort of spectacular way, and they're long passages of grief. But then there's this amazing episode at the end. Homeward from Spain, the Emperor Charles has sped and come to Aix, France's best citadel. Into his hall he climbs the palace steps. There comes to meet him Aude, a fair damoiselle. She asks the king, "Where is the captain dread? Say, where is Roland that promised me to wed?" Then Carlin's heart is filled with heaviness. His eyes weep tears, his snowy beard he rends. "Sister, sweet lady, you ask me for the dead. A man yet nobler I'll give to you instead. Louis, I mean, what better can I else? He is my son, and heir to all my realm. To me, saith Aude, these words are meaningless. God and his saints and angels now forfend I should live on when Roland's life is spent. At Carlin's feet she falls, her hue is fled, she dies forthwith. God give her spirit rest. The French lords weep and grievously lament. And this is obviously a sort of dramatized imaginary moment, but it tells you something, right, about the personal nature. And we're going to leave it here. I think we're going to leave Roland there with the grief of and death of Aude. The personal nature of this story, right? That really these grand clashes of civilization are made meaningful in the poem by the sort of unique, indispensable characters of the Christians and indeed some of the Muslims, right, who engage in it. And for Aude, once Roland is gone, all she can do is join him in heaven. And so that death, and then finally the ministering of justice to Ganelon, which is supernaturally aided, sort of brings the whole thing to some sort of closure, presided over always, right, by a God who visits us even in our pain, in our brokenness, in our death, in our sin. These simple stories that we tell about, oh, it was bad to do the Crusades, right, are a way of avoiding how much more complex this is. And it's so ironic, right? Because when we talk about the Crusades or we talk about the Song of Roland, we caricature them as if they were these, just chauvinistic, like bad Muslims, good Christians. But really, that's us being simplistic. That's us being sort of blithe and debonair about what is, in truth, a very, very profound engagement with what it means to be a believer, to believe unto the point of death in God in a fallen world, right? Do we still have that kind of belief? I'm not saying that you need to go and conquer Spain, but I am saying that either that's true, either there are things for which we must be willing to die, or there's no meaning to life at all. And I said recently that courage, using reference to C.S. Lewis, right? Courage is every virtue at the testing point. And I think that this poem is really about that in some ways. It's about, we believe in God, and we believe that God has spoken to us, and we want to live out a life in which we live according to our faith. And if that means that we must sacrifice ourselves for it, we will. There's a phrase, the summum malum, the highest evil, which means like, what is the thing that you fear most in the world? And at the heart of this poem is a question, right? Do you regard death as the summum malum? Would you rather do anything than die? Would you rather lock yourself in your house? Would you rather be a slave? Would you rather submit to the government, right? All of these things. And the answer that distinguishes nobility and virtue from evil and kind of baseness. The answer is that you must be willing to die for something. Marsil is not, and that is what makes him a scoundrel. The Emir of Babylon is, and that is what makes him admirable, even though he's wrong. Charlemagne and Roland and Oliver are, and that is what makes them the heroes of the poem, because they are willing to die in the service of the true God and the true faith. And I think ultimately, if we believe that that faith is true and that God is real, then we too must be willing to hold him above our own lives. He who loves his life will lose it, and he who hates his life and lays it down for my sake will gain it in the kingdom of heaven and in eternity. I'm going to close it with that because it is ultimately, this poem is a meditation on some level on that saying of Jesus, that in order to gain true and eternal and meaningful and lasting life, you must be willing to lay your life down. Okay, let's do the mailbag. Yo, if there is one thing that you personally can do ASAP to save your country and to save the West. It is get in incredible shape. That is why we at Young Heretics are convinced that lifting is infrastructure. We got the very last run of these shirts the other day, which means there's only a few left. If you want one, you got to get it now before they run out. You go to youngheretics.com/shop, and I will personally rip the sleeves off of your muscle tee for summer 2021. One more time, that's youngheretics.com/shop. Go get them quick. They're going fast. There aren't that many left. I will rip the sleeves off for you personally. youngheretics.com/shop. Okay. Mailbag questions come to me through locals from VIPs. If you are a VIP, thank you so much for your support and for being part of the community. If you're not, go to youngheretics.com/locals and you can become a VIP so that you can ask questions like this one from Tyler. What do you think needs to go into making proper adaptations of classic literature? For instance, can these timeless tales be set in the modern day? And so forth, right? Yeah, this is a really good question. I mean, the one that always comes to mind when this question is asked is Shakespeare, because they're constantly putting Shakespeare in like, ooh, it's Merchant of Venice in a casino. Like, look at this. It's the Merry Wives of Windsor on a cruise ship. And a lot of times for me, that just comes across as gimmicky. But it can work, you know. To me, the real question here is how do you get at the essence of what's being said in a work of literature? So in the Song of Roland, for instance, right, I have just outlined some of the things that I think are core to the poem. Heroism, willingness to die, the clash of civilizations, and this notion that God presides over our sinful brokenness. Now, at a certain point, if you just took those elements, but you put them in a completely different scenario and you didn't have anybody named Roland or somebody named Oliver or anybody named Charlemagne, right, then you wouldn't be really making an adaptation. But I think you can do a lot, you know, because there are great stories, Greek myths, for example, that even in antiquity were delivered in many different ways. They were delivered as part of a philosophical discussion. They were delivered as part of a tragedy, part of an epic poem, right? So form, which is the mode of delivery, doesn't have to be the same. You can change a lot of things. The other thing you have to know is that whenever you adapt, even if you're just taking a book and turning it into a movie, right, the form is part of the experience, it's part of the artistic reality of the thing. So there are certain things that you could never really make in certain forms. For example, Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita is a really amazing work of literature. It's also very morally complex and difficult because it is about a pedophile. It's from the point of view of a pedophile. So obviously it's a morally disgusting person. And yet we kind of see into his inner life. They've tried to make it into movies, but movies are a very literal medium. You see things, right, on camera. And it's just, you know, in a movie, you just get the disgustingness of it. And you don't get the sort of difficult, naughty engagement with his humanity and his inner life, right? There's an example of something that works in one medium and doesn't in another. And the reason for that has to do with the nature of the medium that you're putting it into. So I would say like Roland would make an amazing movie. I'm sure there are great paintings of scenes from the Song of Roland. I don't know like whether you could really make a video game about it because it's only one battle and you have to like invent a bunch of other stuff. But I could be wrong. You could be proven wrong. Basically, I think it's about finding the essence, what the Greeks would call the ousia. Like what is this? What is the core of this thing that's being conveyed and coming across? And how can I get that core in a different medium? So when I go see the movie for Gawain and the Green Knight, for example, I'll be looking to see whether, you know, this kind of high soaring rhetoric, this language that inspires this feeling of heroism, can be turned into a visual presentation of that, and whether you can make that really pop on screen. And different people have different skills, obviously, in doing these kinds of communication. And it's really all about whether the essence of the thing gets across in this new way of doing something. I hope that answers your question, Tyler. Thank you for asking it. Once again, if you want to become a VIP, go to youngheretics.com/locals. So glad that you're all here. It's such a joy to me to go through these incredible, complicated moments of history and literature with you. I hope you learned something. I hope you like the show. If you do like the show, you will also love the work that I do at the Claremont Institute and that we do at the Claremont Institute for the recovery of the American idea. Go Go to claremont.org/donate if you would like to support our work, and go to claremontreviewofbooks.com if you want to read our quarterly. AmericanMind.org if you want to read our more regular online publications. All of them are great, I think, and I am biased because I do work for them, but it's an important time to be supporting institutions like the Claremont Institute, I think. So do check us out, and if you donate, let us know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. That's it for me this time. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and stuff that matters.